She vanished without a word. Snow swallowed her trail. But someone was watching. They would say she vanished, disappeared into the wind like dust off a canyon rim. One moment, Tala Thornfield was the prized daughter of one of the most powerful men west of the Mississippi, poised, pampered, and promised to a man she didn't love. The next, she was gone. Her absence sent tremors through high society parlors and political drawing rooms, through the parlors of Denver and the ballrooms of Santa Fe. A scandal, a disgrace, a mystery wrapped in silence. But what none of them knew, what none of them could imagine, was the storm that had been brewing in her soul for years. Tala had grown up surrounded by silk and silver, her footsteps echoing down marble halls, her every movement shadowed by expectation. She was born into lineage, bred for diplomacy, and shaped into a symbol. Her father, Governor Charles Thornfield, had ambitions that reached beyond borders, and Tala was the cornerstone of a strategic alliance promised to the son of a railroad baron, whose steel tracks carved through native lands like a knife. She wasn't supposed to feel anything about it. She was supposed to smile, to curtsy, to say yes with grace and silence. But something ancient stirred inside her. A whisper. A rebellion. A piece of her spirit she hadn't known still lived the part of her born not in the drawing rooms of privilege, but in the bones of her mother, a Comanche woman who had once danced beneath prairie moons and sang to the wind. Tala had never been told the full story. Her mother died when she was still young, some fever they said, or was it childbirth? No one ever spoke her name. Her portrait had been removed from the sitting room long ago. But Tala remembered her scent, the sound of her lullabies, the feel of her fingers braiding her hair long before the governess took over. And now she was being sold. Not in name, of course. There would be a wedding, a celebration, bells, music, guests in glittering attire. But underneath the lace and law was a contract of control. Tala's stomach twisted every time she looked at the man chosen for her Carter Whitlock heir to Whitlock Rail and Mining. His eyes were calculating. His mouth curled when he smiled, but his gaze held no warmth. When he placed his hand over hers during the engagement dinner, her skin crawled. That night, she stared at the ceiling of her room, draped in velvet, and imagined fire. Not one that consumed the house, but one that cleared the way for something new. The plan formed slowly then, all at once. Tala bribed the stable boy. She stole a map. She packed her mother's pendant, the one she had found hidden in the back of her father's desk, etched with Comanche symbols, and rode out before dawn. Her horse was swift, but not swift enough to outrun the cold or the fear. For the first time in her life, Tala was alone. No attendants, no schedule, no walls to confine her, but no hands to catch her if she fell. And she did fall. She got lost. She crossed frozen creeks and climbed ridges with her hands scraped raw. She ate roots and snow. Her breath came in gasps. Her boots split open. The fine fabric of her gown, now worn in layers to preserve warmth, was soaked through. Her father's men had ridden out after her bloodhounds in tailored coats, and she had heard their calls in the distance. So she cut west. Deeper, further, toward the ungoverned parts of the map where names faded and trails vanished. 3 days passed, then 4. She no longer knew what day it was. Her mind wandered, her body trembled, and on the 6th night, with snow falling heavy and sharp, Tala collapsed beside a pine tree that bent toward the earth like it too had grown weary. She didn't cry. Her eyes were dry, her lips cracked and her limbs heavy. In that final moment, she didn't think of her father or Carter Whitlock or the glittering halls of her past life. She thought of her mother, a woman she barely knew. A woman who had once stood defiant in a world that tried to erase her. Tala whispered a name, maybe her mother's, maybe her own, and let the darkness take her. She didn't see the cabin just over the rise, didn't see the man who would find her. A man who hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks, who carried his grief like a second spine, who lived not to be found and certainly not to find anyone like her. And yet, when he saw her lying there in the snow, broken, beautiful, and burning with something that refused to die, he would carry her inside. And everything he thought was buried would begin to rise. The storm had not passed, not really. It merely stepped aside to let her through. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with warmth and silence. The man, his name was Elias Monroe, had laid Tala by the hearth, her body wrapped in a woolen blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. She had not stirred, not when he lifted her from the snow, not when he carried her across the threshold of a place that hadn't seen another soul in over a year. Her skin was ice, her breath shallow. For a long while he just sat by her watching the fire dance, uncertain if she would live through the night. He hadn't meant to find her. He hadn't meant to look. Elias had carved out this solitude with stubborn hands and a shattered heart. Years ago he'd buried the only woman he'd ever loved beneath a cottonwood tree at the edge of the prairie. Her name had been June. She had laughed with her whole body, with her head thrown back and her hands on her hips, and after she died the world became a dull hum he no longer cared to listen to. But now, here was this girl too young to be anything but brave, too still to be anything but dying. He had tended to her arm first. Torn and bloodied from the rocks, the wound was deep but clean. He boiled water, ground herbs, stitched with the precision of someone who had once known medicine back in the days of war, when lives were measured in minutes. He fed the fire until the room pulsed with heat and waited. Tala woke before dawn, her lashes fluttering, her body curling tighter under the blanket. She did not speak. Neither did he. In those first hours, silence became their truce. She did not ask where she was. He did not ask her name. She was disoriented but alert, moving only to sip water from the cup he left by her side. Her eyes followed him when he moved, not with fear, but with a watchfulness that felt older than her years. When she tried to sit, he reached out instinctively, but she lifted her hand in refusal. There was pride in her, bruised, but not broken. Elias understood. Some kinds of pain were louder than words. He made a stew that evening, just bean salt pork and some roots from the back pantry. When he placed the bowl beside her, she took it without hesitation, eating slowly, deliberately. She never thanked him. He didn't expect her to. Gratitude in that cabin had been replaced by necessity. By the third day, the color returned to her cheeks. She moved with more confidence, carefully sweeping the hearth when she thought he wasn't looking, folding the blanket that had once held her like a second skin. Elias began to notice things, how she chewed on the right side of her mouth, only how she flinched at the crackle of the firewood, how she never sat with her back to a window. She was running. That much was clear, from whom or what he didn't ask. He wouldn't press her. He'd spent too many years learning that not all silence was hollow. One morning, he returned from the barn to find her standing barefoot by the window, wrapped in one of June's old shawls. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and thin as ash. She was staring at the cedar tree, the one that bent toward the barn, like it too had secrets. When he stepped into the room, she turned, not startled, just aware. "They'll come for me," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. He nodded once. "Then they'll find you here." A long silence stretched between them, taut as wire. "They won't come to talk," she added. "I figured," he said. It was the first real exchange they had. From that point on, words began to stitch themselves into the space between them. Not many, not often, but enough. She told him her name. Just that Tala. He didn't press for more. Instead, he showed her how to feed the livestock, how to spot wolf tracks in the snow, how to break ice at the trough without shattering the basin. She watched him closely, absorbing everything. There was grace in her, even in exhaustion. She asked him once why he lived alone. He said, "Because no one followed me out here." She didn't ask anything else. That night he found her kneeling by the fire, humming something low and mournful, a melody that sounded like earth and wind and ghosts. When she noticed him watching, she didn't stop. She only held his gaze as if daring him to ask what the song meant. He didn't. He simply listened. As the days passed, Tala began to reclaim pieces of herself. She mended a torn hem in her skirt with thread she found in a forgotten drawer. She swept the porch without being asked. She fixed a broken latch on the back door. She moved with intention, like someone planting roots despite herself. Elias watched her not with hunger but with something deeper recognition. She was haunted, yes, but not ruined. One evening she asked for fabric, just a strip, any color. He found some old blue cotton and gave it to her. She worked by lamplight, stitching slowly, fingers precise. When he asked what she was making, she didn't answer. But the next morning he sought a small pouch, hand-sewn, tied with a braid of leather. It rested on the mantel, quiet as a prayer. He didn't touch it. Instead, he left a gift of his own, a carved pendant, old and rough-shaped like a feather. He'd made it long ago and never found the right hands for it. Until now. On the 6th night, she stood in the doorway, long after the fire had dimmed her figure outlined in starlight. He joined her, the silence between them, familiar now, almost warm. "They're close," she said. "I know." She didn't turn to him. Just whispered, "I don't want to run anymore." Elias didn't offer comfort. He didn't promise safety, he simply said, by the second day, Tala was steady enough to walk. Not far, not fast, but enough to prove she was alive and determined to stay that way. Elias watched her move about the cabin like someone relearning how to exist. She never asked where she was. She never asked who he was. The silence between them was not empty, it was a kind of agreement. Words could come later. Or not at all. The snow hadn't let up. It clung to the world like a memory that refused to melt. Tala, wrapped in Elias's spare coat and boots, several sizes too large, moved with cautious intention. She swept the hearth without being asked. She folded her blanket neatly when she woke. She kept her distance, but not her eyes. She watched everything. The way Elias sharpened his knife, how he split wood with one clean motion, the careful method he used to check the traps along the tree line. Elias, for his part, said little but saw everything. He noticed how she flinched slightly when his footsteps came too close, how she winced when biting down on the right side of her jaw. There were bruises, half-healed and faint, hidden beneath the collar of her borrowed shirt. He didn't ask. She didn't offer. Still, an unspoken understanding had begun to grow like something small and green, forcing its way through frozen earth. He taught her how to light a fire without flint, how to recognize rabbit tracks from fox. He didn't explain everything, just showed her one quiet gesture at a time. And Tala, used to living behind gilded walls where every motion was judged, and every lesson was a performance, found strange comfort in the way Elias never corrected her with impatience. When she failed to tie a proper knot, he simply handed her another piece of rope. Try again. At night, they shared stew made from root vegetables and salted venison. She always ate slowly, chewing on one side, but her appetite returned gradually. She still slept on the bed, and Elias still took the chair, his rifle always within reach, though never pointed. The third night, she woke from a dream, sweat on her brow, fists clenched. Elias said nothing, just passed her a cup of water. In the quiet afterward, she said her first words since arriving. "Do you ever forget?" He looked at her for a long time. No, he said simply, "but it doesn't mean you stop living." After that, their silences softened. She told him her name, not just Tala, but what it meant in her mother's tongue, Wolf. It seemed fitting, Elias thought, watching her move, wounded but wary eyes always scanning. A creature built to survive. She spoke of nothing before the snow. Nothing about carriages or arranged marriages or the scent of her father's cologne when he leaned in too close to whisper about duty. That life, it seemed, was sealed behind her like a door she no longer intended to open. But what Tala did speak of were instincts, dreams she'd had since childhood, of wild horses running across endless plains of fires that spoke in crackling tongues. She described the sound of wind across the peaks as if it were a language she was just beginning to understand. Elias listened. He wasn't a man given to speech, but when she talked like that, soft, half-hypnotized, he saw something ancient flicker in her eyes, something older than both of them. One afternoon, while gathering firewood, Tala asked Elias why he stayed so far from town. People he answered, that was all. But later, by the fire, he said more. He told her about June, about the illness, about how grief had a taste, and how it lived in the bones longer than anyone wanted to admit. Tala listened without blinking. When he finished, she said, "They told me grief was weakness." Elias gave a dry laugh. "Grief is the strongest thing there is," he said. "It stays even when everything else leaves." 03. That night, Tala didn't sleep in the bed. She sat beside Elias by the fire until dawn, neither of them speaking, both of them simply there. There was no romance in it, no grand gesture. Only the kind of nearness that feels like a pact. The kind forged not by desire, but by survival. The next morning, Tala surprised him. She asked to learn how to shoot. Elias didn't hesitate. He handed her the rifle with the reverence of passing on something sacred. Her hands trembled on the trigger. She missed the first 3 shots. By the 5th, she steadied. By the 7th, she hit the mark. Her eyes flicked to his, not asking for praise, just measuring whether he'd seen. He had. He nodded. In the days that followed, the cabin changed. It no longer felt like a tomb. Tala added little things, a strip of blue cloth stitched into the hem of her tunic, herbs, arranged not for use, but for comfort. She even sang once, quietly, in a language Elias didn't understand, but felt in his marrow. Something about that melody moved through the walls like a blessing. Still, trust came in fragments. One night, Elias returned from checking traps to find Tala standing at the edge of the tree line, watching the horizon. "I thought you left," he said. "I almost did," she replied. "But I couldn't." She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. By then, Elias knew. Knew that survival was more than food and fire. It was memory. It was letting someone sit close enough to see the cracks. It was knowing that the quiet between them had become something more than silence. And though neither would say it aloud, both understood the moment they stopped running was the moment they started choosing. And choices like survival had to be made every day. The storm arrived not with thunder, but with silence. No birdsong, no wind. Just a stillness that blanketed the land like a breath held too long. Elias stood on the porch, his hands rough from years of solitude, wrapped around a cup of coffee he never tasted. His breath curled into the air and vanished. Beside him, Tala stood in a blanket, one he once thought he'd use to bury the past. Between them, silence was no barrier. It was a language. Then came the shimmer. A ripple on the horizon. The faintest shift of white dust against the ridge. Then came the sound hoofbeats, dozens a distant rumble like drums buried deep in the earth. Tala didn't flinch. She only straightened her spine and let the blanket fall away. She stepped forward, the cold forgotten. "They're here," she said. "My father." Chief Naru. Elias saw them crest the hill like ghosts pulled from legend, 70 riders silent and painted for war moving as one. Their faces bore the stories of generations in red and black. Feathers braided into horse manes danced in the wind. At their center was the man on a black stallion wearing a wolf fur cloak, his face streaked with red like war tears carved into stone. Tala walked ahead of Elias toward the cedar tree, the very place she had once collapsed, nearly lost. That tree bent from years of prairie wind now stood tall like a witness. The riders circled the house in a wide arc. No one spoke. Chief Naru dismounted and crossed the snow alone. Not with fury, but with the steady grace of a man burdened by tribe history and love. "I ran," Tala said. "You did," he answered. "I chose. You were not meant to." Her eyes flicked to Elias. "He didn't take me," she said. "He gave me space to breathe." Naru's gaze landed on Elias. "You sheltered her." "I didn't mean to," Elias replied. "But yes." The chief's expression darkened not with anger, but with judgment. He unhooked a ceremonial blade from his belt, old marked with the etchings of stories passed through generations. He held it out not to attack, but to test. "Come," he said. Elias looked at Tala. She nodded once. He stepped forward, took the blade, and followed Naru into the hills. No words passed between them. None were needed. They found a deer. Young, unaware. Naru gestured for Elias to take the shot. Elias did steady hands and breath, like a man who had known too much loss to miss. The arrow struck clean behind the shoulder. No suffering, just stillness. When they returned, Naru stood again before his daughter and the man who had kept her warm. "You don't speak our tongue," Naru said to Elias, "but you carry silence like a man who understands its weight." "I won't go back," Tala said. "Not to chains disguised as marriage. I won't belong to anyone but myself." Her father's face softened for the first time. "You are no longer of my fire," he said, voice low and solemn, "but you are not gone from my heart." Without another word he mounted his horse and rode away. The riders followed. No war, no blood, just departure. Tala turned to Elias. She trembled not from cold, but from what had been released inside her. He stepped forward, gently taking her hand. "You don't belong to me," he whispered. "I know," she said, "but I want to stay." He nodded. "Then stay." And beneath a sky washed clean of storm, something unspoken began to grow quiet, sure and lasting. The dawn after the storm carried a fragile tranquility. Pale sunlight filtered through drifting clouds, and the prairie whispered with dew-softened grasses. At the creek's edge, Elias sat on the dew-kissed earth, the morning chill wrapping around him like a faded memory. In his hand, he held an arrow he had retrieved from the deer. Its shaft was smooth still warm from the journey beneath flesh and bone. The hunt had been more than ritual, it was a reckoning, a promise. Now, as he examined its flight, he realized that his life had fractured into before and after Tala. Behind him, Tala moved quietly, carrying a woven basket, brimming with gathered herbs, echinacea, for strength, wild mint to soothe the soul, and a small bundle of sage for cleansing. She knelt beside him, placing the basket gently in the grass. Together they watched dragonflies skim the creek surface, their wings catching the light like broken glass. This moment, serene and sacred, stretched between them, unforced, uncompelled. "You carried the burden." "Well," she said, her voice soft as early morning wind. It was the first time she had praised him. He looked up at her, surprised by the tenderness shining in her eyes. "I had no choice," Elias answered, though he meant otherwise. She reached for his hand, their fingers interlaced. In that simple touch he felt gravitas and grace, the grace of being seen, and the gravity of a future no longer dictated by fate, but fashioned by choice. They stood and walked back toward the cabin, side by side. Each step was measured silent, mindful. The world had changed, shaken free of old shadows, but the work of building a new life had only begun. In the kitchen, sunlight warmed the wooden table near the window. Elias lifted the carved cradle. He had begun the cradle that now needed lining and care. Near the hearth, Tala unfolded the bright fabric she had sewn, patching together pieces of his wife's shawl into new garments, each stitch a bridge between past and present. "We grow our own story now," he whispered. She smiled and began spooning oats and berries into 2 bowls. As soon as she set the dishes before him, she paused. "I want to help you build more than a home," she said, voice earnest. "I want to shape the land with you." Elias nodded without hesitation. "I do too." For the rest of the morning they worked together. Ella, Elias's mare, soot-covered from the storm, stood tied at the fence. Tala fetched fresh cloth and braided new ribbons into the horse's mane, and Elias brushed earth and sap from her coat. Then he handed Tala reins and motioned for her to lead Ella into the yard. With quiet confidence, Tala guided the mare through a short trot, her posture strong, her eyes glimmering with purpose. As the horse responded to her touch, Elias recognized something profound. Tala was not merely surviving this world, she was mastering it. Later, as he repaired the barn door, he glanced at Tala kneeling in the garden, her hands working the soil. She dug small trenches, planting seeds of corn and squash. The garden had been barren all winter. Now, under her care, it bloomed with hope. Each seed tucked into the rich earth was an affirmation, a life chosen, not given. They paused for midday supper, roasted vegetables, freshly baked flatbread herbs from her basket. The food carried a new warmth, not just the warmth of hearth, but of intention. They ate slowly, mindful of every bite, every shared glance. When twilight came, they lit lanterns and sat together on the porch. A gentle breeze carried the promise of spring. Above them, the sky was an expanse of muted blue, and for the first time the night felt like an invitation, not a warning. Tala leaned her head on Elias's shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her and let the silence enfold them. "Elias," she said after a long pause, "will you walk with me into all that comes next?" Oh, it wasn't a request. It was a covenant. His reply was in his heart first. Then he kissed her forehead. "I already am." In the days that followed, word spread that Nahili had not just survived, she had rooted. A few neighboring farmers stopped by with offers of seeds or tools. Some brought simple words of respect, others puzzled looks. But most importantly, Tala's presence on the land became undeniable. She guided a horse as deftly as any rancher. She harvested greens with nimble fingers, and she welcomed villagers who came calling with quiet warmth. Her confidence became contagious. Elias noticed how she greeted each visitor with steady eyes and honest words. He noticed how children lingered on the porch to hear her speak. He noticed the way she offered them teas made from creek-grown herbs. He noticed how she began teaching Tommy, now mellow and steady, to weave simple baskets from willow twigs. Parents told him that their fine boy was learning gratitude and patience lessons not found in gunfire. One afternoon, Elias rode into town with Tala riding beside him. The townspeople paused, exchanging glances. The general storekeeper met their eyes and nodded. The schoolteacher stopped sweeping the steps and smiled. Even ranch hands tipped their hats. It was a quiet acknowledgement, meaning had shifted. Tala was not a curiosity. She was part of the landscape now, a living testament to partnership rooted in respect, resilience, and choice. The day came when Tala stood at the cedar tree once more, the same one where her flight had begun. This time she had a bundle of seeds in her hand and offered them to the tree's ancient roots. Elias watched as she let the seeds fall, and small wildflowers sprouted as if awakened by her presence. She turned to him. and he saw both vulnerability and strength in her gaze. "I planted the cradle by the creek," she said. "I want a name for what grows inside me." Elias took her hands. "We'll name it together." Tayla's belly swelled with promise, and Tyr will come soon into a world shaped by love rather than obligation. The cradle, the one Elias carved rounded and strong, rests near the hearth, awaiting life. The cradle is his hands, and her breath carved with silent prayers. At night, they sit beneath lantern light and speak of lessons learned to the bravery it took to cross a world that rejected her, the trust she placed in a man who suffered, and how that trust healed more than sorrow. They speak of future hardships they plan for harvests and celebrations, and they name their hopes aloud. The townsfolk marvel at the transformation of the hillside home, smoke curling straight and steady, horses' groomed fences repaired, and standing tall garden plots rich with green promise. But most marvel at the two people standing together, an unlikely pair, yes, but unmistakably rooted. Elias kneels by Tala when she rests her hand on her belly. "You chose to stay," he says softly. She leans forward and kisses his cheek. "You chose to let me." He smiles, then stands with her. Together they open the door and step outside into the honey-gold light of spring. The prairie stretches out before them, alive and waiting. The cedar tree overhead stands silent, witness its branches whispering ancient blessings. They begin walking, first slowly, then with purpose, carrying seeds and story cradle and wonder. A life chosen, not given. And they walk forward together, in the vast unforgiving land of the American frontier, where silence stretches wider than the sky and wounds run deeper than rivers. Two souls collided not by fate, but by quiet choices made in the face of fear. Tala Thornfield, once a caged heiress locked behind velvet curtains and political expectations, fled from a future not of her choosing. Driven by the memory of her Comanche mother and a fire she could never silence, she left behind the comforts of privilege for the uncertainties of the wilderness. Her journey was not just through land, but through pain, identity, and reclamation. Elias, once a man hardened by grief and silence, after the death of his wife and child, lived only to endure. But when Tala collapsed near his cabin, cold, broken, yet burning with unspoken strength, he opened a door he had long believed closed forever. Through her resilience and compassion, he began to remember how to live again, not in shadows but in shared warmth and purpose. Together, they built not just a home, but a life crafted from mutual respect, hard work, and a love that asked for nothing but gave everything. Their story is one of transformation, from fear to freedom, from sorrow to strength, from strangers to soulmates. It is a story that reminds us that healing does not come in grand declarations, but in the daily acts of choosing each other, of planting seeds, repairing fences, and carving cradles, even when the world stands ready to judge. Theirs was not a love of escape or rescue, but of recognition. In a world that had tried to write both their fates, they rewrote the ending together. This story teaches us that true love is not something you find, it is something you build one act of kindness, one moment of courage at a time. It teaches us that choosing yourself, your peace, and your path, even when the world demands otherwise, is not selfish, it's sacred. And it reminds us that home is not where you come from, it's where someone sees your wounds and stays anyway. In our own lives, we often carry past hurts like Elias, or find ourselves trapped in lives we didn't choose like Tala. But healing begins with the smallest decision to speak, to leave, to trust again. Whether in love and purpose or in our sense of identity, we all have the power to step off the expected path and walk towards something more honest, more human, and more whole. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you see your own journey in a new light, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button. Your encouragement fuels our mission to bring more powerful, untold stories from the wild frontier straight to your screen. There's more legend, more truth, and more fire ahead. Stay with us. Because every story worth telling begins with a choice, and we're just getting started.